Thank you very much. Now, I should start by saying that I came to the subject of real abstraction not by reading Marxist texts, with which I'm not actually very familiar, but from within the study of ancient Greek texts. Most of my publication is not on philosophy or economics at all. It's on ancient Greek literature, particularly tragedy. So this is something of a kind of sideline for me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be critical of Sohn-Rethel. But I won't be concerned with two obvious sins of omission. One is that he does not involve in his theory the labor theory of value. I consider, as I've already said, that he rightly rejects its relevance for his particular project. I would admit that I think, as Conrad has pointed out, the labor theory of value has is relevant to certain implications of Sohn-Rethel's theory and analysis, but it's not actually relevant, as he correctly says, it's not exactly relevant to Sohn-Rethel's analysis of the commodity exchange itself. I'm also not going to comment on the fact that he says remarkably little, almost nothing, about Greek society and Greek philosophy, and so he hardly distinguishes them from capitalism and from Immanuel Kant. Instead, I'll start by summarizing Sohn-Rethel's analysis of real abstraction in a way that brings out some problems within the analysis itself. Secondly, I'm going to nevertheless vindicate and extend Sohn-Rethel's claim that coin money was a crucial factor in the genesis of Western philosophy by firstly reshaping the problematic features of his account, and secondly adducing material, historical, numismatic, philosophical, that he himself does not mention. Now, I start then with 3 moments of Sohn-Rethel's scheme of commodity exchange as giving rise to abstraction. And at this point, I will give you a PowerPoint. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. I mean, Sohn-Rethel is obsessively lucid, but sometimes he can be confusing. Here are 2 basic statements about real abstraction. Wherever commodity exchange takes place, it does so in effective abstraction from use. This is an abstraction not in mind, but in fact. Basic statement of his thesis. Secondly, this abstract and purely social physicality of exchange has no existence other than in the human mind, but it does not spring from the mind. It looks there as if he's saying that real abstraction is not in the mind, but actually it has no existence other than in the mind. Of course, the solution is that it originates in action and then exists in the mind. And the action in which it originates is possibly not what we would normally call an abstraction, but a separation of 2 physical acts, namely use on the one hand and exchange on the other hand of commodities. Now, a second moment in his analysis is this. He says that in commodity exchange, quote, there are indeed 2 abstractions interlocked with each other. This isn't often registered with Sohn-Rethel. One is real abstraction, the other is the abstraction of pure quantity. This second abstraction derives, as does real abstraction, from the action of commodity exchange. More specifically, from what he calls the postulate of equality of numerical value, between the commodities exchanged, which arises from the action of bringing together the commodities for exchange. Now, what is the relationship between real abstraction and this second abstraction, the abstraction of pure quantity? Sohn-Rethel is unclear on this. He gives us only two clues. He calls them interlocking, and he says that the abstraction of pure quantity gains in importance by its association with a corresponding abstraction, namely real abstraction. Now, it's unclear to me, at least, whether these two abstractions form a sequence, and if so, whether the sequence is logical or historical, or both, or whether they amplify each other by being experienced together or merged. This is not the only place in which Sohn-Rethel's formal analysis might be tested and supplemented by cognitive science. Note that Sohn-Rethel insists that it is the confrontation of commodities that brings into being the equality postulate, and therefore the abstraction of pure quantity, rather than vice versa. This contains an important truth, but note also that any stabilization of prices will in practice base commodity exchange on pre-existing numerical equality between commodities, or between commodities and coins. Thirdly, real abstraction, we have seen, originates in action but exists only in the mind. However, that does not mean that we discern it. Discerning it depended on something that is undoubtedly a historical development, the advent of coined money. What he says is that, quote, the real abstraction inherent in exchange becomes discernible only in coined money. This reification of real abstraction in coinage is associated by Sohn-Rethel with what he calls the conversion of real abstraction into conceptual abstraction, of which the first manifestation is Greek philosophy. Now, this clearly historical third point is immediately beset by two problems. Firstly, how do we decide which of the two interlocking abstractions of commodity exchange are reified in coinage and therefore for the first time discerned? Sohn-Rethel assumes that it is real abstraction, but a more obvious candidate is the abstraction of pure quantity, because it is purely numerical abstraction, the abstraction of pure quantity, that is, as an indirect result of the equality postulate, reified in coinage. Alternatively, the two abstractions are, as just suggested, experientially, though not conceptually, the same abstraction. Now, the second problem encountered by Sohn-Rethel's historical point is a purely historical one. Coinage was first used by the Greeks, but commodity exchange long predated Greek civilization. Nevertheless, claims Sohn-Rethel, it is in Greek civilization that commodity exchange is for the first time sufficiently prevalent to constitute what he calls the social synthesis, by forming a coherent network embracing independent producers and traders. And coinage is, according to Sohn-Rethel, a product of this new kind of social synthesis. So for Sohn-Rethel, coinage, commodity exchange as social synthesis, and philosophy go historically together. The problem is that he envisages the economies of pre-Greek civilizations, Egypt and Mesopotamia, as consisting entirely of direct appropriation by the center, temple or palace, without money, and accordingly seems to assume that coinage was the earliest money. However, in Mesopotamia, in particular, the extent of commodity exchange and of money functions performed by uncoined silver in particular, especially as revealed by recent research, was considerable enough to cast some doubt on any radical distinction between Greece and Mesopotamia in respect of the degree of commodification and monetization. Whether the Mesopotamians used money before the Greeks depends on your definition of money, but certainly they used money functions. That's a highly technical question that I cannot pursue here. The problem for Sohn-Rethel is that given that there was a degree of commodification and monetization in ancient Mesopotamia, and given that even uncoined money may, like coinage, reify abstract value, why did that not produce in Mesopotamia anything like Greek philosophy? So overall, Sohn-Rethel's analysis of real abstraction leaves us with problems and huge gaps over and above those which are often pointed out. Nevertheless, he is, I claim, right to connect coined money with the genesis of philosophy. For this connection, I emphasize two kinds of argument. Firstly, both coined monetization and a radically new conception of the world, philosophy. Now, it's not clear, of course, what philosophy is. I won't go into that now, but on a certain definition of philosophy, it occurred for the first time in Greece. And so did coin monetization. That was the first time that those things occurred, with the possible exception of India and China. And secondly, they occurred together at the same time in the same place, coin money and philosophy. And the same is true of India and China. That is a very striking fact. Incidentally, literacy doesn't occur in India until much, which is often associated with the beginnings of Greek philosophy, doesn't occur in India until long after the advent of a philosophy strikingly similar to Greek philosophy, which occurred in India. Now, in Greece, this occurrence of both philosophy and coin money was in the Ionian city-states in the early 6th century BC. And for 2 centuries, those two things, philosophy and coin money, remained almost exclusively Greek. By the way, Sohn-Rethel puts the invention of coinage around 680 BC. It has since been downdated by 2 generations or so, making the temporal fit with the genesis of philosophy exact. Now, the second kind of consideration in favor of the rightness of Sohn-Rethel's association of beginning of coinage with the beginning of philosophy is the distinctive nature of the coin, and it is to this that I devote what remains of my talk. Now, Greek coinage was generally silver, but sometimes gold and occasionally bronze. From the beginning, its conventional value was different from its metallic value, and almost always slightly greater than its metallic value. Otherwise, it would have been melted down, but it wasn't on the whole melted down. If you melt down coinage with conventional value greater than its metallic value, obviously you lose value. So coinage is distinctive in 3 respects in particular. Firstly, it has no use value, unlike precious metal money. Secondly, it has 2 exchange values. Firstly, as metal, were it to be melted down, and secondly, as by convention, uniformly and unchangingly embodying the same exchange abstraction, the same numerical exchange abstraction. Thirdly, it seems that what the coin embodies is not, or at least not directly, the unchangingness of real abstraction, which lasts only during the exchange of commodities, but the other abstraction, what Sohn-Rethel calls the abstraction of pure quantity, that is present as numerical value in commodities. The ideal pure quantity, the numerical value of the coin, if it is to function as a coin, must be postulated as lasting beyond each exchange. It must be postulated as identically and permanently present in the coin in all future exchanges, irrespective of time and place. Now, gold and silver perform money functions, but were always also commodities. Their value depended entirely on their weight and purity, and they could at any time be shaped into various items of use. But as for the coin, because its only function is to be money, every instance of its exchange is founded on its circulation. As I noted earlier, although there is truth in Sohn-Rethel's view that the equality postulate, which gives rise to the abstraction of pure quantity, is created by commodity exchange rather than vice versa, in practice, it generally precedes and enables particular commodity exchanges. So a coin has two values, its value as metal and its conventional value, which is exactly the same for all coins of its type, unchanging and disconnected from the material of the coin. Given that value requires substance, or seems to require substance, this implies that the coin somehow combines two distinct substances, material substance and another substance that is abstract and unchanging. This latter substance seems to combine materiality and abstraction, but it is more specific than Sohn-Rethel's real abstraction. I name it abstraction in matter. I suggest that the distinctively Greek universal use of abstraction in matter explains features of Greek philosophy better than does Sohn-Rethel's real abstraction of commodity exchange as a whole. Now, I'm going to go on to illustrate this claim by four correspondences between the abstraction in matter of coined money and early Greek philosophy, the early Greek philosophical cosmos. Firstly, the abstraction in matter of nature, or the cosmos. Central to the cosmology of the first philosophers in Ionia was the idea that the cosmos is composed of a single substance that is transformed from and into everything else. This is a cosmization of the universal exchangeability of money. I don't know what else it can be. Nobody's ever explained what else, where else that comes from. I use cosmization in the sense described by the sociologist Peter Berger, though he has no interest in money at all. He says, there is an inherent logic that impels every nomos, meaning a meaningful human order, to expand into wider areas of meaning. If the ordering activity of society never attains to totality, it may yet be described as totalizing. Cosmization is the process through which nomos and cosmos appear to be coextensive. That's rather a grand way of putting the obvious, and an obvious example is monarchy. Monarchy extends to the whole cosmos, obviously, and for good reasons. Now, it's also true, of course, of money. It's not so obvious with money, but when monarchy in Greece is, the power of monarchy is replaced by the power of money, the universal power of money is, universal power of monarchy is replaced by the universal power of money. The cosmization mechanism doesn't stop. It just has money rather than the monarch as its object. Now, along with this process, the single substance of the Ionians is either entirely abstract, as is the unlimited of Anaximander, which is what, according to Anaximander, all things are transformed from and into, or it is a substance that is transparent, in motion, tenuous, insubstantial. For Thales, water; for Anaximenes, air; for Heraclitus, fire. This semi-abstraction of matter expresses, I suggest, the abstraction in matter of coinage. There is a sense in which it contrasts with, but culminates in, the complete abstraction of being. In Parmenides, to this I will return. That's the first correspondence. The second correspondence is the abstraction in matter of the subject. In Berger's scheme, cosmization or cosmic projection may be accompanied by introjection. In Greek texts, the abstraction in matter of coinage is both cosmized and introjected. Money establishes in practice the seeming self-sufficiency, even the isolation of the individual, and it is introjected as providing a model for imagining the inner self. Introjected are the polarities of one and many, abstract and concrete. Just as diverse concrete commodities are united and controlled by the unitary abstract value substance of an individual's money, so the diverse emotions, sensations, and desires of the individual consciousness and perceptions, of course, are imagined as united and controlled by the unitary abstract inner self.
Not enough material, so I'll tell you any type of one so you can bail out.
Two observations about this. Firstly, Sohn-Rethel derived the Kantian transcendental unity of self-consciousness from the exchange abstraction without distinguishing Kantian from ancient Greek self-consciousness. Just one obvious example of a fundamental difference between the two is that, according to Kant, I cannot know as an object that which I must presuppose in order to know any object.
The white bishop now, the white bishop has to move.
Could someone, I'm hearing sound. Could somebody be asked to turn their, can you hear it? It stopped. Okay, there was background noise, but it seems to have stopped. So Kant says, in attaching I to our thoughts, we designate the subject only transcendentally, without noting in it any quality whatsoever, in fact, without knowing anything of it, either directly or by inference. But the Greek inner self, by contrast, the soul, or psyche, notably as described by Plato, is an entity in the world that can be known. Indeed, it is the task of the philosopher to get to know it. Secondly, Sohn-Rethel made his claim without being aware, it seems, of any of the numerous ancient Greek texts which imagine the inner self in monetary terms. For example, Plato in Phaedo says that the soul gathers itself from all parts of the body and in being by itself achieves wisdom, which is, as he puts it, quote, the only right coinage for which all those things, pleasures, pains, fears, must be exchanged. Philo of Alexandria called the soul numisma, coinage, its mark, the eternal logos impressed by the seal of God. And there are numerous other such passages which I mentioned in my book, Money in the Early Greek Mind, and in various papers subsequent to that. Now, most significantly, Plato in the Republic remarks that the guardians of his ideal state should be told that they have divine gold and silver coinage from the gods always in their souls, and that they should have no conduct with the polluting coinage of the common people. This passage brings me to my third monetary feature of the early Greek philosophical cosmos, which is the relationship between the possession and the circulation of money. Now, I'm now going to put on the screen a well-known passage of Marx's Grundrisse, which describes the contradiction of money in its final completed character. This contradiction I sometimes call the dual essence of money, and sometimes I call it money as unity of opposites, but Marx calls it a contradiction. The contradiction is mentioned in the first sentence and best epitomized in the final two sentences. I can really posit its being for myself only by giving it up as mere being for others. If I want to cling to it, it evaporates in my hand to become a mere phantom of real wealth. But more specifically interesting to me is the other two emphasized passages. As the general form of wealth, the whole world of real riches stands opposite to it. It, that is money, is their pure abstraction as the general form of wealth. On the other side, as material representative of general wealth, it is realized only by being thrown back into circulation. So the materiality of money is associated with its circulation, one of what I call two essences of money. And money as abstraction is associated with simply the general form of wealth. Now, bear that passage in mind as I go on to the next, which I'm not, for some reason, not able to do. See if I can. Why? That's better. Right, okay. Now, what Marx is talking about in that passage is a society which is pre-capitalist, but pervasively monetized. And that is what Greek society, ancient Greek society is, pre-capitalist, but pervasively monetized. I should also add the very important point that in the ancient Greek economy, possessed money is on the whole stored, hoarded, not invested. Two very basic, philosophically fundamental point about the ancient Greek economy. Now, with all that in mind, let's look at this table of opposites, which is implicit, or almost all of it is implicit in that passage of Plato, in which, as I said, he says, well, the philosophers, the guardians, should have divine gold and silver coinage from the gods always in their souls, and the circulation of money among the common people is polluting. So this gives us an opposition between the abstract or invisible on the one hand and the material on the other hand. Possession, which is in ancient world storage, so that money stays where it isn't in motion as capital, on the one hand, and the circulation of money on the other. Parmenides on the one hand, Heraclitus on the other. Now, then the unchanging on the one side, constant circulation on the other. The individual on the one hand and community on the other. Possession of money is individual. That's the kind of possession I'm talking about. Whereas circulation of money is in the community. And the abstraction of money is introjected into the soul by the philosopher, of course, which then contrasts with the changing, perishing body. Now, what I'm suggesting, of course, here implicitly is that the abstract entity, which is one of the two substances of the coin, the unchanging abstract value substance of the coin as opposed to its materiality, is what is cosmized in Parmenides' revolutionary notion that there's only one thing that exists. It is abstract, it is unchanging, it is invariant in space and time, it is eternal. And this, of course, brings me into collision with Roberto Finelli's paper. And I have to say about that here we have Parmenides, what is new about Parmenides' city, Elea? What is new about the Elea into which he was born? What is new about it is the arrival and rapid spread of coinage. That's the only discernibly new thing about this city-state. Language hasn't changed. People's relationship to language hasn't changed. And yet, Roberto, a Marxist, rejects the economic explanation of this cognitive revolution in favor of a non-economic relation for which there's no basis, which is the relation of people to language. Now, that is extraordinary. I know why he's doing it, but it's extraordinary that he as a Marxist should reject an economic explanation, which is, in my view, inevitable. There's no other proper explanation of it. Anyway, we'll come back to that issue again with Plato. Now, as a further argument in favor of my view and the view of others on where Parmenides is one abstract, unchanging being, which is so uncannily like monetary value substance inherent in the coin, where it comes from, something I've never actually published, but it strikes me now as really quite important, is the way in which Parmenides describes his one being with normative vocabulary. He says that it's held in place by justice and by fate. Why? He also says that it's asilon. Now, asilon means inviolate. This looks very much like the projection of a social endorsement of individual private property. We know that Parmenides was a wealthy aristocrat. And in the proem to his poem, he stresses the fact that he alone has been given this wisdom by the goddess. Heraclitus, on the other hand, whose philosophy is the projection of monetary circulation, not of possession, but of circulation, the other of the two dual essences of money, Heraclitus is constantly stressing the communality of the logos, of this abstract formula, according to which the elements are transformed into each other. So Parmenides is expressing the individual, Heraclitus is expressing the community. And this is one of many further points I don't have time to go into, which reinforces the polarity that you have on the screen. So the normative value, the normative words that Parmenides uses to describe his one seems to me to be exactly what you'd expect if this is a cosmization of monetized individual property. But there's a philological point which may amuse you, which only occurred to me recently, which is this. It's a rather small, may seem a small point, but it reveals so much, which is that in one of the fragments of Parmenides, he's clearly trying to show that the world, namely his one being, is eternal. And he says, well, if it isn't eternal, where did it come from? But he puts that by saying what kreos caused it to come into being. And scholars almost universally translate that as need. So he's saying, well, it's eternal because what need caused this being to come into being? The trouble is that kreos doesn't mean need. It cannot mean need. It really doesn't mean need. It means debt. That's what it means, no question. But how can you say what debt caused this being to come into being? Unless you have some sense of the economics of metaphysics, it doesn't make any sense at all. Say what debt causes come into being. So everybody mistranslates it, almost everybody mistranslates it as need. It's what you call the ideological mistranslation. And there's no way around that. It just doesn't mean need, it means debt. Okay. Now, this strong attachment of Parmenides to abstract being is held in place by justice and fate, and it is inviolate and so on, reappears in a different form and much more lyrically and seductively in his successor, Plato. Plato is passionate in seductively describing his devotion to self-contained abstract being and to the philosophical assimilation of the soul to unchanging abstract being. Now, this devotion is not just a matter of Parmenides and Plato. Platonism is by far the most important school of philosophy in antiquity. It was, if anything, was the philosophy of the elite. And of course, it continues on into Christianity, its synthesis with Augustine and so on. So this isn't an individual phenomenon, it's a whole social phenomenon initiated in the monetary revolution in the writings of Parmenides and Plato. Now, I'll come on to Plato's theory of forms in a minute, but why is that this paradoxical, comprehensive devotion to something, abstract being, after all, does not exist? It's not just because abstract being provides Plato and others with their livelihood and leisure, but also it's because its basic features of self-containment must blind them to the sources of their wealth. And of course, we ask in this conference, has this ancient, politically significant, passionate, self-blinding devotion to self-contained abstraction persisted in a very different form into our world? Now, rather than suggesting examples from our political discourse, which would not be difficult, I propose to compare fleetingly and mischievously something that looks very different, the necessary blindness of modern scholarship on ancient philosophy. You could search all ethnographic literature for a taboo as fiercely universal as the taboo against investigating the sources of the metaphysical preconceptions of ancient philosophy. It's not that the scholars have considered and rejected the possibility of an extra textual influence on, say, the Parmenidean doctrine of being. No, it's almost never even considered. Instead, Parmenides is revered as the first person ever to do philosophy, despite the fact that Aristotle called Parmenidean doctrine almost insane. It's a bit like 18th century biblical criticism, where there is meticulous reconstruction of the meaning of the Bible, but the source of meaning has no interest, no significance. This is the word of an individual, God. And the study of ancient philosophy on the whole is pretty much firmly rooted methodologically in the 18th century, I would say. Now, my fourth and final monetary feature of early Greek philosophical cosmos is the impersonality of money and of nature. Now, three features in particular are shared by coinage and nature as conceived by the Ionian philosophers or proto-scientists. They are firstly ubiquitous uniformity in time and space. Secondly, the invisibility of what is fundamental. And thirdly, impersonality, what Sohn-Rethel calls the division of society from nature. And it is this impersonality that crucially removes personal divine agency from nature. And where does this revolution suddenly come from? Sohn-Rethel derives it from real abstraction. He says, by their abstraction from all reality of use, the concepts also lose all human reference and retain non-human nature as their only content. This is despite the fact that the non-human nature discussed by the earliest philosophers has all the sensual qualities that real abstraction eliminates. Here again, what seems to me important is the functioning of coinage. The gift, which holds together pre-monetary societies, such as Homeric society, for example, the gift retains something of the personality of its donor, thereby maintaining a link, however tenuous, between its donor and its recipient. But money can only function as money if completely detached from its owner, or detachable from its owner in exchange. To be sure, this is true of uncoined precious metal money as well as of coined silver, but uncoined precious metal may also be shaped into various items of use and acquire personal associations, whereas coinage, if it is to perform its only function, must be always and essentially impersonal. And it's this, I suggest briefly, that is at the root of the crucial impersonality of the abstraction in matter of nature as envisaged by pre-Socratic philosophers. Now, those are my 4 correspondences. Now, so far, much, though not all I've said, is already described or indicated in my publications. But I want to end with an entirely new suggestion. The unchanging ideal value of the coin is expressed mainly by virtue of the image expressed on it. There's a coin, Athenian coin with the goddess Athena on it. The features of abstraction, detachment from matter, unchangingness, are regarded as inhering in the coin by virtue, or mainly by virtue, of its image. But what does by virtue of mean? An image of, say, the goddess Athena on an Athenian coin evokes the presence of something else, the goddess Athena. But it also, in association with the material of the coin, guarantees the presence of another equally invisible entity, ideal, substance of unchanging numerical value, 4 drachmas. Now, the idea of a mere image or copy, familiar though it is to us, is not found in the earliest Greek texts. For example, not even in the detailed and comprehensive picture of society that you find in Homeric epic. So what we regard as the image of Athena in her temple at Troy in Homer is not called an image, it's called Athena. And when she rejects the prayers of the Trojans, she does so by moving her head. That is Athena that they're praying to, not an image of Athena. The idea of the mere image or copy emerges in Greek texts from the end of the 6th century BC, roughly speaking. But the first writer to focus on the question of what it is to be a copy is Plato. This is in itself a momentous conceptual innovation, as well as being central to Plato's metaphysics. A recent 400-page study of Plato begins with the sentence, Plato's philosophy is a metaphysics of the image. Platons Philosophie ist eine Metaphysik des Bildes. This is because the idea of a mere image or copy provides Plato with his dual ontology. An image of a bed is a real image, but is not a real bed. It has some reality, but less reality than the bed that it copies. It is ontologically inferior. Now, the ontological inferiority inherent in an image also applies to the bed itself, which is, according to Plato, a mere image of the abstract form of a bed. And incidentally, that abstract form of the bed is itself dependent on abstract being, which is of a Parmenidean kind, which has no particular form. And this is where I really take issue with Roberto Finelli, because the point about the maker of the bed, the craftsman, is not that he's being somehow valorized by Plato or Socrates. What he's making, a real bed, is ontologically inferior to the form of a bed. That's the point. And that form of the bed is ontologically inferior to being in itself. Plato is not, as Roberto says, concerned to demolish Parmenides. Plato's Parmenides, the dialogue Parmenides, is a description of Parmenides in his old age coming to Athens and meeting the young Socrates. And Parmenides is clearly a revered figure. And Socrates puts his idea to the elderly Parmenides and discusses his theory of forms, or his nascent theory of forms, and never really resolves certain issues. The theory of forms isn't an attempt to demolish Parmenides. The theory of forms is an attempt to reconcile Parmenidean logic with the existence of particulars, which undoubtedly have some kind of existence, an inferior existence according to Plato. who wants to avoid the insanity, as Aristotle called it, of Parmenidean doctrine, while also privileging abstract being. You end up with a theory of forms. Now, I could go more into that, but I'm not going to here. But I've no doubt that abstract monetary value it is that gives rise in the mind of Plato to the idea that an abstract bed is more real than a concrete one. I cannot think of any other reason why that extraordinarily influential doctrine should arise. But what I want to do, instead of dwelling on that, is to seek the historical origin of the emergence of the idea of a copy. Now, I can't present all the details of this complex argument here. I've written it up and it will eventually appear, but I confine myself to two basic points. Firstly, the association of the image or mere copy with mere seeming, as opposed to being, occurs first in pre-Socratic philosophy, specifically in Xenophanes and Heraclitus, who criticize the anthropomorphic images of the gods as not representing the reality of deity. This pre-Socratic reality of deity is profoundly influenced by money. For Xenophanes, God is impersonal, abstract, and ubiquitous. For Heraclitus, it is the unity of opposites, conceptions which respectively are influenced by dual essences, possessed monetary value on the one hand and monetized exchange, circulation on the other. I should add that a current project of mine is to take the unity of opposites inherent in monetized exchange and trace its influence, its effect on Greek culture as a whole. This has never been done, as far as I can see, not only on philosophy, but on tragedy, and indeed on visual art. So that's what my mind is working on at the moment. But that's again beside the point. What I'm suggesting here is that it is monetization that separates the reality of deity from the images, with the result that that the image then becomes a mere image because it doesn't represent the reality of deity. That's absolutely crucial in the development of the concept of the mere image. And of course, that whole issue of the status of images of gods goes on for hundreds of years into the Byzantine epoch and beyond. Now, my second point, my final point, is this. The first mass reproduction of images was on coinage. The pervasion of ordinary everyday life by mass-produced images, so familiar to us, occurred for the Greeks, if at all, on coins. What we call an image was in early Greek practice, in Homer and so on, imagined as embodying what we say it merely represents. But such embodiment, whether of Athena or of an owl, is precisely what a coin image must not do. There's a partial exception here when, in the Hellenistic period, much later than the origins of coinage, coins begin to have the heads of sovereigns on them, kings on them. And you might say, well, there's an embodiment there of the power of the king. But I won't go into that. But it is a potential exception to what I'm talking about, which doesn't overturn my principle. The coin image is composed of matter, but it must embody abstract, or at least make present abstract value to the strict exclusion of everything else. It must be imagined as a mere image or copy. And there are reasons for believing that this was an important source of the new idea of the mere image. And so the influence of monetary value on Platonic philosophy was both direct as a model for the abstract entity inhering material objects such as beds, and indirect as making available in coinage the idea of a mere image, which is central to Platonic metaphysics. Now, the idea of the mere image then, firstly, provided a model for the first ever explicit expression of dual ontology, of some entities being more real than others. And secondly, and more specifically, provided the idea of a mere image that consists of mere matter is ontologically inferior, but is nevertheless inseparable from abstract value. All these points come together, and at that point, I draw to a close. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Richard. That was an excellent and very, very clear exposition of your position. What I'd like to do now, if you can drop the screen sharing, Richard.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. There's for some reason I press escape, nothing's happening. What do I do? I haven't had
You
this.
have to click the button
I think
that you used.
I think I've just got us back onto a screen anyway.
Can you not get rid of that image?
Well, insofar as I can try. Yes, we're back.
Okay.
Good. Okay, thanks very much, Richard. I'm sure that will bring about questions, provocations, agreement. So who would like to start? Conrad.
Okay, I guess you guys are probably getting familiar with me at this point, but I wanted to ask you, Richard. So I thought it was very interesting what you said about, the discrepancy between Sohn-Rethel's description of ancient Egypt and the actuality of their economy, which I think is more complex. I remember reading, I don't know if you know, she's an Egyptologist, Catherine M. Cooney, but I read some work she did on like the labor in ancient Egyptian society. And I was totally fascinated, right? You had this very, very developed economy with the sort of aristocracy, the artisan-like development of urban labor, the way tribute functioned. It wasn't a slaveholding system. So I was very, in commerce. So I think in a way, what this tells us is that maybe this periodization that Sohn-Rethel relies on in terms of, unilateral appropriation, private appropriation, maybe it's a bit oversimplified, right? In any case, but I wanted to ask you about another subject along these lines. So you were, if I understand you properly, and I agree with you if this is the case, what you're saying is that we actually have to seek the constituents of abstraction prior to money in things like units of account, right? Which can precede money, uniform currency, let's say. But nevertheless have a relationship to abstraction. And then you were talking a little bit about, other cultures and contexts. Now, I think in, if I'm not mistaken, like in India, like Charvaka atheism was around the same time coins were created. But if you looked, how much research have you done into the Chinese context? Because I think in my research, I found like the 100 schools of thought in China emerged around the same time. You had money being coined there. So what do you know? I'm just curious about the Chinese context and what your opinion is about, the relationship between their abstraction and money, but also, abstraction prior to money in a sense, as values kind of congealing, but when that hasn't happened.
Yeah, you made a number of points. I take it the China one is probably the one you want to answer. Yeah. My latest book was a very detailed historical comparison of early Greek philosophy and early Indian philosophy. And Indian philosophy a few years ago was completely new to me. So I've spent years just completely immersed in these early Indian texts, which is completely fascinating. And I produced this book. And then one of the points you made about the book is, well, why didn't you do China as well? And I thought, oh my God, there's another 10 years of my life. But there's a serious point, because I do mention China in my book, and I briefly indicate the same kind of analysis could be given to China, because the similarity between early Indian and early Greek metaphysics is astonishing. And the normal response, in my view, the sort of reflex response, is to imagine that there was influence. And this is the explanation. There could not have been influence. It's inconceivable. And that can be, it's not, when I say inconceivable, that's the wrong word. I mean, it is extremely unlikely. That's simply because people have no other means of explaining these remarkable similarities. I do, which is India is one of the very first societies outside the Greek city-state to be monetized, and to be monetized by the widespread use of coins. And similarly with China, you have these three societies, which are the first societies in history to be monetized. And not only are they the first to produce philosophy, but also their philosophy, their metaphysics is remarkably similar. And there are basically three similarities you find between early Greek metaphysics and early Indian metaphysics. In both cases, you can see it coming into being. The earliest texts, Homer, the Rig Veda, have nothing like this, but early Greek philosophy and the Upanishads are full of it. Firstly, there is the comprehensive, identifiable inner self, the unit, the Atman, the Psuke. Secondly, there is a universal abstract principle with which the inner self is identified, Brahman in India. Thirdly, there is reincarnation, which corresponds to the circulation of commodities. And all this is set out in my book. So this point that Marx makes about what I call the dual essences of money, of possession and circulation, hasn't been realized. It is philosophically, on a global scale, absolutely fundamental. And Sohn-Rethel, of course, had no conception of that. He has therefore the problem, why is it that Parmenides and Heraclitus are at polar opposites? Well, it's because for reasons that are very interesting, Parmenides cosmizes the possession of money and Heraclitus' circulation. In India and in Plato, you have both. You have Brahman. Atman is Brahman, this static universal abstract principle, but you also have karma, and you have reincarnation, which is the circulation of the soul. Similarly, Plato propounds a doctrine of circulation of the soul in reincarnation, which is the stage you shouldn't fall into, because you're cultivating the unchanging abstract nature of your own soul. So this basic structure is there in India and Greece. Now, is it there in China? Well, reincarnation isn't, but in my book, I briefly indicate that the idea of a universal abstract principle, the Tao, is there, it comes into being in China about the same time as the universal exchangeability of coinage. But I can't say any more than that, because it would, as I say, it would take years to actually show that was the case. It may not be the case that there's this correlation, but that's the answer to your question.
Okay, so I just want to be clear about one thing. So going back and just to the question of India a little bit, because I'm kind of going over the ancient world here, but I read a book by a student of my BA supervisor, graduate student of my BA supervisor, and it dealt with Miletus. And the basic argument of the book was that a lot of the influences on Miletian society and early Miletian philosophy were conveyed to it, through forms of exchange or cultural transmission from India. So, do you reject that?
Yeah.
Okay.
What I don't reject is the idea that the Indians got the idea of coinage indirectly from the Greeks. That we just don't know, but that is certainly possible. In fact, it's quite likely, to some extent, to be true. What I do reject is the idea that this group of Indian sages in the Ganges area hear a rumor that 3,500 miles away, this man Parmenides has come up with the idea that everything you see around you is an illusion. In fact, the whole world is composed of one abstract thing. And they say, what a great idea that is. Let's incorporate that and write about it and teach it and so on and so forth, even though there's absolutely no evidence for that view in the 2,800 miles between Greece and the Ganges area. No evidence at all, right? But somehow that idea has found its way along trade routes into this self-contained group of Indian priests, right? And they latch on it and say, what a great idea. Or the other way around. But this idea comes from the Indian priests, travels 3,000 miles through places where there's no trace of it ever, and then arrives in Elea, and Parmenides says, what a great idea. Now, what if that idea had arrived in Thames on the River Thames in 500 BC? why not? Would people say, what a fantastic idea. Nothing really exists except this one abstract thing. That's a great idea. Let's adopt that as our central metaphysics. It's completely inconceivable. Even if there was influence, you can only have influence where societies have enough in common to make the intellectual influence possible. Influence, like metaphor, is one of those words which are used in myriads of ways to block access to what's really going on.
Okay, thank you very much.
So you can read that in the second, that and much more of that kind in the second chapter of my book.
Okay, I've only read Money in the Early Greek Mind, so I have to read the others, But
okay, who else would like to ask a question? Ben, you're muted.
Hey, thank you for the interesting talk. I don't think it's true that before coinage, there was no monetization. If you look at the work of Michael Hudson and what they call the Assyriologists at the Peabody Museum, I mean, I think you're saying something interesting about coinage and the development of philosophy, but the first coins were status values.
Well,
the first, you could say the first free labor movement were mercenary soldiers, an early industrial, an early military industrial complex. And what
yes,
you're...
Sorry, go on. I don't want to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I'm very incoherent, sorry.
No, not at all. I'm not saying that there was no monetization before coinage. In fact, I'm saying that there were certainly money functions in the ancient Near East well before coinage. And Conrad mentioned the unit of account, which is like a form of abstraction. But coinage is different from earlier forms of money. Now, I spent 6 months in the library of SOAS reading all the economic literature I could find on the ancient Near East. And it occurred to me that, of course, in the end, the question of whether there is money before Greek coinage depends on your definition of money. If we define money on the basis of modern money, that it performs all 4 money functions: means of payment, means of exchange, measure of value, store of value. It's also issued by the state. And there is no such thing as money. It's performing all those functions and issued by the state and with a conventional value greater than its material value. There's no such thing as money before coinage. But you don't have to define money like that. You can define it much more broadly. But the important thing is not to get involved in a definitional dispute about what money is, but to recognize that there are money functions. And when they're all contained in the same object, you've definitely got money. What you find well before Greek coinage is the unit of account, the measure of value, means of payment, often not universal, but partial. So you've got money functions. So that's the first point. So I agree with you. And clearly you could say there was monetization before coinage. What I'm saying is that coinage is a very special form of money, which had philosophical consequences.
Yeah, it's a very special form of money. Go into your image of the coin, you know, face of Athenia or the king of Lydia. I think that those are geopolitical functions, not monetary functions.
Well, I mean, I think with the king of Lydia, I mean, the fact is that the Lydians, it may be in Lydia that the first coins emerged because they had all this electrum, you know, flowing down the river Pactolus. That's why Croesus was so rich. But Lydia was very, very soon thereafter conquered by the Persians and never became a pervasively monetized society in the way that the Greek city-state was. To be sure, originally at least, the symbols on coins can mean all sorts of things. And if you've got a symbol of Croesus, that's clearly a symbol of royal power. And in one sense, it's a real representation of Croesus. But in the city-state, you get images of all sorts of things, you know, dolphins, birds, owls, turtles, various individuals, gods, and so on. And their function is cannot be described simply in terms of the particular associations of the thing which is represented. The main function is to be exactly like every other image on every other such coin, which guarantees the abstract value of that coin. Now, the whole question of the origins of coinage that you raise, was it mercenaries, was it something else? That's something I go into in my book, Money in the Early Greek Mind. So my book, Money in the Early Greek Mind, contains a detailed account of the origins of coinage, what the particular factors were which allowed it to be invented, together with then an account of the cultural consequences. Now, of course, things change, and that book was written almost 20 years ago. So there needs to be updates.
Yeah, I'm just too incoherent in my thoughts to say anything sensible about it.
No, not at all. No, that's a very good question.
I mean, I think coinage, and if it comes out of proto-coinage, as in people trade in lumps of metal because they're useful, but I see the whole coinage thing as coming out of, you know, massive collapse of the previous empire type things, Mesopotamia.
Well, that raises a big question about the overall conditions for these new cultures, one of which was the Greek city-state, in the collapse of those empires and the advent of the Iron Age and the particular characteristics of iron that served as the basis for this new political form, which was the city-state. But that's a really big issue. Yeah.
Totally different.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ben. I want to bring somebody else in. John Thompson.
Cool, thanks. Sorry. Thanks very much for our talk. Yeah, my question is, it's related to, I went to a talk a few months ago by John Milios, and he was relying on GM Stakwa to argue that you couldn't think of money as the same way in Greek society as later. And he was pointing to systems of accounts. Oh, sorry, I have the silly thing in front of the camera, sorry. He was pointing to systems of accounts. He was using examples that after, that not everything could be reduced down to money. That in Greek accounting, you would have, okay, the amount of drachma you had, but also, okay, the amount of horses you took, the amount of slaves, etc., that there were separate columns for them in their accounts, and they couldn't all be totalized back to money. I'm wondering, is that true? How do you deal with that? Does it make a difference? I sort of understand that maybe it mightn't, that it's like, is that money hasn't got all its functions, it's not fully universalized, but I'd like to hear more about that. And my last point is, I find the stuff in the image really, really interesting, but and yeah, cool. So if you could answer that, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I've read that paper by Milios and also the work of the Saint-Croix on which it is based. It's slightly odd. I mean, it's not wrong, but bear in mind that the Saint-Croix had an unusual interest in accounting, because that was what his very first paper was written on. He wrote the classic case of ancient Greek accounting. And so he has a peculiar, he may be overemphasizing its overall significance to the economy, but undoubtedly there is some truth in what Milios and de Saint-Croix say. And it's hardly surprising that money was not as all-pervasive administratively as it is in the modern world. I mean, here's an example. There's no reason to disbelieve this narrative from Plutarch describing Pericles, who, of course, lived in the 5th century BC, Athens. And he says what Pericles did was as follows. He got all the produce from his estate. By he means he got a servant to do this, of course. All the produce of his estate every year was sold off. And the money was then used to buy what was ever needed in the subsequent months. And he represents that as something, you know, a little bit different. And that allowed him, says Plutarch, to engage in politics because he had all the leisure. Now, that says a great truth. It says, firstly, that the economy is agricultural. He doesn't own shares or investments. He's just got land. But that land produces crops which come in and then can be exchanged into money. And from that money, he lives. Now that's a pretty good picture of the ancient elite. We have Plato's will. I've never seen this before, but I was reading Diogenes Laertius, but we have Plato's will. There's no reason to disbelieve it. It's perfectly credible. What did Plato leave in his will? No stocks and shares, and not much by way of goods in kind. He left land, he left slaves, and he left gold and silver, including coins, right? So that's what he left. That again would be perfectly typical. This coheres with all those statements, which de Saint-Croix doesn't even consider, because de Saint-Croix doesn't really do much in the literature, actually. He's a sort of obsessive, somewhat, I mean, immensely broad in some ways, but in other ways rather narrow historian. He's not really concerned with literary texts, but there's all that literary stuff in tragedy, in Thucydides, in 5th century literature about money. I mean, no Egyptian text could say something like, well, money is the most powerful thing in the world. Money threatens other values. Or something is said in Thucydides, whoever has money in a war wins. I mean, that's inconceivable in Homer, it's inconceivable in Mesopotamia, right? You've got the god on your side, you win, or you have ability and you win. You don't win by just having the most money. And there's masses of stuff like this. Masses of it, and Marx was aware of this actually. Masses of this stuff already in the 5th century BC. Now that reflects a monetized economy. In Aristophanes, when you go to the market to buy fish, you take coins with you just to buy a fish, you know, and you have these very coins of very low value. So it's certainly monetized society. Not only that, but that has emerged into the consciousness of people. For example, Aristophanes, there's another joke. I really like this joke. I don't know why, but that people are discussing whether Zeus really rules the universe. Does Zeus really rule the universe? And the answer is, yes, he does, because he's got the most money, right? Now that's an enormously, it's a sort of funny, meant to be funny, but it's an enormously interesting thing to say, given what I'm saying about the metaphysics of money. So there's masses of the stuff at that level. All I'm doing is saying, well, it's unsurprising that this is cosmized. If it's universally powerful, as well as being abstract and so on, then it's going to be cosmized, and that's exactly what we find. So it's a good point that you make, but I don't think it affects my argument very much.
Okay, any more questions? We still have a reasonable amount of time. And I always think if you have somebody who's an expert in the field, you should exploit them for as long as possible.
There's a chat from Matt.
I see Matt, yeah, has a question.
Hi, thank you. Richard, I'm only moderately familiar with your work, and I thank you very much for this presentation. It was very illuminating, and I'm going to try to do a kind of speculative question based on your presentation and your hints at how the money form may have impacted artistic practice or the art form, and Jolle's earlier assertion from yesterday that that the artwork might represent a type of synthesis or at least a unity of intellectual and manual labor. Your unity of opposites in the money form seems to be pointing to a similar problem, but I want to bring in someone from outside the panel and also a later time period where Dave Beach has recently done a lot of historical research on how art the formation of art was a process of breaking from guild labor and aligning itself more with the scholarly and liberal arts, seemingly moving further away from craft-based, concrete, norm-governed labor and towards abstract, speculative, spec-based production. And if your argument is, to a certain degree, is that there's an inferiority to matter and form embodied in the money form that makes its way into art, or thought that may make its way into art, I'm wondering if there's any evidence that you've found in that earlier period that might point to some of those techniques of elevation, as Dave calls them.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I should say about ancient visual art that one of the most striking symptoms of the academic division of labor is that people who write about ancient texts don't say anything about ancient art and vice versa, except with some exceptions in the sense that there's plenty of stuff about how this vase painting shows you this scene as described in the text of Sophocles and so on. But what there isn't is, at least not known to me, is a serious attempt to identify the preconceptions which inform both visual art and literary texts, and indeed philosophical texts. That, so far as I can see, just doesn't exist. This is what I'm trying to move into to some extent. It'd be very odd if there were no such shared preconceptions. I mean, this is Athens, say, in the 5th century BC, is producing this astonishing texts and these astonishing sculptures and vase paintings. And are we really saying it's a small society? You know, I mean, it's a face-to-face society. These people know each other. The consumers of these objects are the same people. The craftsmen and the tragedians would have encountered it. So how can there not be some shared preconception here, however disguised it is by the difference in art form? That's the first point I would make. Then I can't really address the issues that you've raised very easily, because it's not something I've researched in the ancient world. I mean, part of my project here will have to involve patient.
Richard, I think you've knocked your mic down.
Oh,
We've got you back. We've got
can you
you
hear me?
back.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm waving my hands. I shouldn't do that. When normally it doesn't matter, but on Zoom it does matter. So I'll try to stop doing that. Okay. Now, what I would say is that the basic preconception shared by text and visual art that I am thinking about, and I hope this may interest you, is present in commodity exchange, because monetized commodity exchange in particular can be described slightly differently from the way Sohn-Rethel describes it. He talks about practical solipsism, but a unity of opposites. It creates a perfect unity, but the interests of both parties are completely opposed, to put it briefly, right? So the unity of opposites, in a sense, is the basis of the Greek polis, but it's also fundamental to Heraclitus, for whom the world is composed of the unity of opposites, and it is fundamental. You can see it. It's a growing importance in visual art, right? From a different conception both in visual art and in text, which is the power of the aggregate. So in Homer, great long lists of warriors, and early Greek vase painting, long files of mourners and soldiers and so on. That tends to be replaced in both texts and in visual art by a harmony of opposites and an antagonism between two parties, which forms a perfect whole. Now, that's the basic idea, okay? So this requires a lot of work in areas I as yet know nothing about, but that is at least a shared preconception which has an economic basis. It's shared by visual art, by text, and has an economic basis, so it qualifies as a sort of thing I've been complaining just doesn't exist. That's pretty much now the sum of what I can contribute on the question of visual art in the ancient world. But so I've got a lot to learn. So thank you for your stimulating question.
Okay. Is there somebody else who would like to ask something? Conrad.
Okay, I'm going to come back for one more, and this time I'll try to ask you a bit more of a direct question. Richard, so earlier we were talking about the Seine-Croix and his account of ancient Greek history and how, in some respects, it might differ from what I guess you could describe as the Thompsonian school somehow. And I thought it was interesting because I said I read through the class struggle in the ancient Greek world. And I noticed that Seine-Croix, he actually criticizes Thompson quite harshly, because Thompson, as we know, was a big influence on Sohn-Rethel. He actually criticizes Thompson quite harshly because he says Thompson seems to espoused this idea that in ancient Athens, there was something like a sort of commercial bourgeois that were generated, and commerce became this extremely important thing. And if I understand St. Croix correctly, his argument would be that, well, not, the basis of the Athenian economy really was not that. It would have been tributary extraction, naturally, but more specifically, and more importantly, when it comes to the extraction of large amounts of surplus product, slavery and the use of that. So again, I don't think this is necessarily fatal with respect to even if we were to accept St. Croix's analysis, which I'm not saying we should do. I don't necessarily think it's fatal to the notion of real abstraction in the ancient world. But I just wondered where you stand on that debate.
Yes, first of all, let me say about Thompson and Sohn-Rethel is that I think they both claim, certainly Thompson does, that they came independently to their ideas about the relationship between monetization and early philosophy. They then indeed collaborated, and Sohn-Rethel lived in Birmingham, where Thompson was professor of Greek. But what is publicly stated is that they came independently to the same idea, which I think is quite interesting. Now, as for de St. Croix and Thompson, yes, he's very harshly critical. Now, de St. Croix, I don't disagree with de St. Croix's economic analysis and his analysis of class. And I mean, he's particularly concerned to show, firstly, that of course, that slaves or people without property were a class, even though they were not self-consciously a class. He ransacks Marx to find evidence for his view that you can be a class even if you're not conscious of yourself as a class. Okay, basically, he's thinking of class in terms of property ownership. You belong to one class if you don't own any property, whether you're a slave or a free man, supposed free man, and you belong to another class if you do. And most property, as people would generally agree, is agricultural. But the point is that the main form of the extraction of surplus value, such as it is through slavery, and that makes it, according to Croix, pretty much a slave society, even though the surplus value extracted may be far less as a proportion of the whole economy than it is in a modern capitalist economy. Okay, so that's all fair enough. And what he objects to in Thompson is the idea that a commercial class has taken over politically, right? And de St. Croix is on the whole right about that. The only place where he may not be right is southern Italy, where there is some evidence that commerce had become politically important with Pythagoras, for example, or the Pythagoreans. It didn't last very long. There was this period in which it would appear that Pythagoreans were in control of several city-states in the south of Italy, and it looks very much as if those were people with commercial interests. However, on the whole, de St. Croix is right to suppose that the ruling elite, the political elite in the world, their wealth was in land. Okay. However, what de St. Croix has no interest in is, for example, metaphysics, none whatsoever. And Thompson and de St. Croix are really talking about metaphysics. And Thompson and Sohn-Rethel are talking about metaphysics.
We've lost you again, Richard.
Sorry, I'm waving my hand, so I'm stopped. De St. Croix has no interest in metaphysics. He has very little interest in literature. The only point at which he finds a literary text with an interesting ideology is in the fables of Aesop, which he thinks represent the views of the exploited class. But he certainly has no interest in metaphysics. But Thompson and Sohn-Rethel are interested in metaphysics, and what they say about monetization and metaphysics seems to be clearly correct. It's not that de St. Croix rejects that. He's just not interested in it at all. What he's interested in is the relationship between politics and economics, and in that respect, he's right. But he misses most of the point of what Thompson and Sohn-Rethel, I don't think he mentioned Sohn-Rethel, but he misses most of the point of what Thompson is saying, which is a pity because he's great on class. It would have been great if de Saint-Croix had been able to extend his interest to further aspects of the ideology, rather than those aspects of the ideology he's interested in, which is simply ways the upper class had of justifying their exploitation of the poor. And that's really all he's interested in.
Howard?
Yes, thanks, Richard. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I have actually a question from an intervention that you made yesterday, and that is you referred to the significance of slavery for the atomist philosophers, if I understood correctly. And I wonder if you would care to comment more on that.
Yes, what I mentioned, I think, that you're thinking of was slavery, not an atomism, though atomism is a whole interesting subject. Atomism and money is a very interesting subject, which I mean, you find atomism in ancient India as well as ancient Greece, and I go into that a little bit in my book, 2020. But what I mentioned about slavery was its importance in Plato's metaphysics. And it is really rather remarkable, it's never really been properly exposed, that when Plato uses when Plato describes the relationship between abstract and concrete, between reason and desire and so on, the language he sometimes uses is the language of slavery. Now, the natural instinct of certain scholars is to say that this is a metaphor for something. What I mean by saying the word metaphor is so abused. Well, a metaphor for what, you know? No, it isn't a metaphor, it's a projection of the social relation of slavery onto the cosmos. That's what it is. It's not a metaphor for something a bit nicer than slavery. And you can see this all the time in the way people discuss metaphysics. For example, I mean, some people think that when Plato refers to the bed as a copy of the form of the bed, then he's using copy or image as a metaphor. Well, again, metaphor for what? It isn't a metaphor for anything. It's a projection of that relationship onto the structure of reality. And so, unsurprisingly, Plato, who depends on slaves for his well-being, just as Plato depends on two things for his well-being: money and slaves. That's all he needs. I mean, when he himself was kidnapped and was going to be sold into slavery, he was rescued by a ransom raised by his friends, which consisted of money. You know, that was the sort of world it was. And what he leaves in his will is money and slaves. So it's hardly surprising to find that central to his metaphysics is abstract being, and that the domination of abstract being over the concrete is expressed as slavery. I mean, this is exactly what you would expect. It arouses almost no interest among Platonists, who are sort of still seduced by this devotion to abstract being, this passionate devotion to abstract being, which seems to drive out all sense of the relation of abstract being to anything else.
Okay, have we any other questions? Okay, I'm going to do something I don't often do and ask one myself. And I mean, I find the historical discussion fascinating, but I want to just focus on whether or not it's fair to say, in terms of real abstraction, money has a special quality in contrast to other forms of real abstraction of other objects or categories. What is it about? Because I think there is something about money as an abstraction that is readily recognized by everybody who uses it. And I think you said that near the start. For example, we know that while we have money, we have an exchange value. But if any of you have ever had an experience I once had of being in a toilet in a place a long way away where there was no toilet paper and I just had my wallet, money just became paper. So I just wondered if you wanted to say a little something about money as a particular and special form of real abstraction.
Yes, your toilet situation is in effect described by Aristotle when he's talking about the arbitrariness of coin money, and he says, you know, when you're in the desert and you haven't got any water, I think that's the example he uses. Money's no good to you at all. There are instances, there are contexts, says Aristotle, in which money is completely useless for you. So your toilet situation has been well anticipated by Aristotle in the first serious discussion of money. So your question, so I'm not quite sure about the specificity of your question. Could you specify it?
The specificity is that money is constantly and continuously recognized in abstraction by the people who use it in a way other objects, commodities, and forms are not.
Well, yes. I mean, the only function of money is to contain, embody this abstraction. I mean, clearly, the Holy Communion, the bread can embody the salvation or the blood of Christ or whatever, and that is an abstraction. But even the bread is an object that is eaten, if you see what I mean. And there's no other object I know whose only function is to embody abstract being, which is universal. I mean, things, you might say, you could even think of an object whose only function is to embody an abstraction, but embodying abstract being is quite different. If your only function is to embody abstract being, and that abstract being is socially, universally powerful, then you've got something which is quite distinctive, right? I don't know whether that answers your question, and one could say more, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's what I wanted to get at. There is something very specific and probably rare about money as that embodied abstraction in the world.
Yeah, it has no other function.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Any last questions before we sign off for a break? Conrad.
I'm just gonna keep coming back till the time runs out, Richard. But I hope you don't mind. I hope you're not too tired right now.
No, I'm fine. I can go on forever.
Okay, good. Yeah, what I wanted to ask also was, so you talked a little bit about, you were alluding here to like sort of theological abstractions, which were characteristic of Christianity. You know, I've struggled a little bit in terms of my account of, you know, I'm kind of developing, but my account of the subject, you know, or the proto-subject, or however you might describe it, and how it relates to value, right? So for me, you know, you have this sort of hypokimenon substance, right, value. This becomes, you know, the ego cogito, or living subject, when you have the valorization of labor power, the commodification of labor power, right? But this does raise a big question regarding intermediary modes of abstraction, and, you know, I've been trying to work it out. But how do you, I know like Alberto Toscano, for example, has said, well, religion's a real abstraction. He's analyzed Marx's comments on Christianity and commodity exchange. How do you feel, like, do you feel comfortable? I don't know. I know you're not an expert in the Middle Ages, but how do you think the conception of real abstraction is modified, you know, within the context of, modified and sort of projected within the context of Christianity in Rome and the Middle Ages? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, as you say, I mean, I'm no expert on that, but I mean, just consider one aspect of monetized abstraction that I was talking about, which is the invisibility of the soul, right? Which I relate to the introjection of monetary value, along with other features of monetary value, the unity of the soul, and the unity of monetary value in relation to the diversity which it controls. If you consider the invisibility of the soul, and the invisibility of the soul is not there in the earliest beliefs in Homer, for example. The soul is not of a different kind of being from the body. It's matter. That the soul should belong to be a radically different kind of being, which is abstract and invisible, is something you first really get in Plato. I mean, it's prefigured in Heraclitus, but it's really first there in Plato. Now that is a notion which is historically enormously influential. I mean, it's still with us, is it not? Among those people who believe in the existence of a soul. And so it's there in early Christianity. I'm sure it's not the only belief in early Christianity, and you no doubt find pictures in medieval painting of a soul, but for the most part you don't, because the soul is enormously important, but it is abstract and invisible as well as unitary. So that's a fixture, right? So there's an example of something Platonic, which has gone on into the Middle Ages. But there are also, of course, revivals of Platonism in 17th century England, and the power of Plato to occupy a central emotional place among intellectuals in Europe, in the Italian Renaissance, 17th century England and beyond, is very, very considerable. Even though they may not, as it were, subscribe completely to the theory of forms, there are certain aspects of Platonic doctrine that they will subscribe to. So I can't speak specifically about the Middle Ages, but it does at least, I'm raising, what I'm suggesting here, of course, is the sort of thing I'm talking about is not just a Greek phenomenon. It doesn't just sort of fizzle out when Plato dies. What Parmenides and Plato do is to create the definitive version of something which has a very, very long afterlife, and which originates not in the minds of two individuals, but in an economic transformation, which is also still with us in a sense.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Howard, have you got another question, or is that just your hand up?
Yes, I have a quick one. Just along those lines, have you given any thought to, just in the way in which you reflected on the Middle Ages, to alchemy and its persistence through the medieval period, its beginning in the ancient world and persistence through the medieval period?
The answer to your question is no, I haven't. Though it's one of those questions that I will have to ponder, which may set off a train of thought. So thank you for that. But the simple answer is no, I haven't thought about it.
Okay, good.
Okay, that seems to me to be a really good point to close the session, because certainly we've had gold for the last session as opposed to any base metals. Thanks very much, Richard, for a really, really interesting discussion, both in terms of what you said and the way in which the questions added to the debate. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here. It's now, well, for me, it's 12 minutes past 8. If you're in Eastern time, it's 12 minutes past 3. And if you're in California, I think it's 12 minutes past 12. We have until on the hour, so 9 o'clock, 4 o'clock, or 1 o'clock. So we've got a break of about 47 minutes for you to eat biscuits, drink, a blute, and hopefully you'll be back at on the hour, the next hour, because we have Jason Moore joining us to actually complete the day, and I'm sure it will be a barnstormer. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in about now 46 minutes.
Jason Moore is going to complete the day. Hopefully he's also going to complete the dialectic, and we won't have to think anymore. So we'll see how that goes.
Thanks a lot, Richard. That was great.
Thank you very much.